Hi, Hope City. It's Phil here, and today I want to talk to you about Sabbath keeping. And I want to do this as part of our series about contemplative practices. My hope is that the series of conversations will help us build some of these practices into our lives so that we can really slow down and experience God. So my hope today for our mini sermon is that you're going to come away with two things. The first being a deeper understanding of what Sabbath keeping is and why it's actually prescribed throughout Scripture. And the second thing I want you to come away with is a plan to build Sabbath keeping into your weekly rhythm. And so with that said, I want to ask you, maybe hit pause right now or maybe after this, just to grab a pen, get some paper so that you can take some notes down. Or, if you have your phones on you, and most of you do, just grab your phone and open up a note-taking app because there's going to be specific questions. There's going to be specific decisions that I'd love for you to make today and then act out or try out, experiment with later on throughout the week, all right? So the first thing I want to address is the question, what is Sabbath keeping? Well, Sabbath keeping is the practice of taking one day of the week to rest, to intentionally receive and live into the gift of rest that God gives us so that we can free our lives from being dominated and distorted by overwork. Let me say that again. Sabbath keeping is the practice of taking one day off just to rest. And we do so that we can intentionally receive and live into the gift of rest that God gives us so that we can free our lives from being dominated and distorted by overwork. See, Sabbath keeping is intentional rest. It's not rest as a result of just working ourselves into exhaustion and our bodies finally just shut down and rest. No, Sabbath keeping is intentional rest. It's rest that we prioritize, it's rest that we plan, and it's rest that we consciously choose to live into. Specifically, Sabbath keeping involves, I think, two movements. Sabbath keeping is rest that invites us to let go, all right? Invites us to let go. And then Sabbath keeping, once we've let go, is this rest that invites us to receive, that there's something from God that we need to receive, that we can only receive when we rest. And so why do we practice Sabbath keeping? I'm going to get into, the letting go and the receiving in a moment, but I want to address this next question. Why do we practice Sabbath keeping? We practice Sabbath keeping so that we can slow down and so that we can create space for God to encounter us. For God to encounter us, for God to transform us by His grace. The reality is that you and I, we are simply too busy for God. And the thing is, this year in 2021, I don't want you to miss out. I don't want to miss out. And I think if we don't slow down, we are going to miss out on what God is doing in our lives and how He wants to meet with us and how He wants to transform us by His grace. So we practice Sabbath keeping so that we can slow down, create space to encounter God. But secondly, we also need to practice Sabbath keeping because the threat of burnout is real. There are some real consequences to burnout. There's physical and emotional exhaustion where you feel like you have nothing left to give. Or when you're burnt out, you experience cynicism and detachment where you start to not care about anything anymore. You're too tired to care. Or when you're burnt out, you just feel ineffective and you feel like whatever you do doesn't really accomplish anything. Like you're trying, but nothing seems to make a difference. There's real consequences to burnout. And the fatigue that you and I experience is multi-layered. There's the fatigue of our bodies, right? Where sometimes we start life and we start the day at a deficit, where the night before we didn't get enough sleep. Maybe throughout the last day we didn't really eat nutritious food and we neglected to exercise. I don't know about you, but I can function off of 5 to 6 hours of sleep, but I probably need at least 8 or 9 to be healthy, both physically and emotionally. I don't know if you've ever had a bad night of sleep and then you wake up and you're stressed and you're kind of snappy with everyone. We need that rest physically and emotionally. You know, we experience the fatigue of the body. We also push our bodies to the limit. We live off of coffee and fast food and all-nighters. We go from one task to another. Often, I don't know about you, but my eyes are just dry because of all the screen time and all the Zoom meetings. And I'm sitting in front of my computer at home most of the time, and my posture really suffers as a result of this. There's a fatigue of the body that you and I experience. But it doesn't just stop there. There's the fatigue of the mind as well. This is informational fatigue, where throughout the day, you and I are bombarded by ceaseless information. We don't even have enough time to absorb or process this information. Whether it's from emails or articles we're reading for school or for work, to our Twitter timelines and our Facebook news feeds and our Instagram stories, we're just getting bombarded by information and we have no time to process. And when it comes to fatigue of our minds, we also experience emotional fatigue, where life just keeps on happening whether we are ready or not, whether we have processed stuff from last week or not. And often we're just responding and reacting, and we don't have the time and the space to really see what's frustrating us and what grieves us. That's the fatigue of the mind. And finally, there's the fatigue of the soul, where we really have little space or time to actually be with God. And when we are doing spiritual things, it's often hurried and rushed, and it's something that we do rather than a person that we encounter, that we spend time with, that we slow down with. And sometimes we wonder why we're reading scripture, we're reading lots of it, but none of it is sinking in. It's because we're not slowing down to actually be with God. The irony is that so much of what we do in Christian ministry or service isn't actually being with God. Serving God isn't actually being with Him. Being with Him involves and it requires us to slow down. So the question I want you to, think about right now is, what part of you is experiencing the most fatigue right now? What part of you is experiencing the most fatigue? Is it your body? Or is it your mind? Or is it your soul? Right? And maybe as you're thinking about that, I want to keep going. The third reason that we practice Sabbath keeping is this call to rest is actually a commandment. I feel like this is something I need to mention, because when we're talking about Sabbath keeping, I talk about it as an invitation. I'm inviting us as a church to participate in it. But Scripture sees Sabbath keeping as a commandment. It was not a suggestion. It's not an invitation. It's a prescription. It's like a needed vaccine for a sickness that all of humanity is susceptible to and actually suffering from. And I feel like this needs to be said as well, that the 10 Commandments were given to the people of Israel not as a means of salvation. They're not saved by following the 10 Commandments. They were saved first. They were rescued out of Egypt first. And then as they come out of Egypt and as they're learning how to live life as God has intended, He gives them 10 Commandments to guide them so that they may thrive in how they live. But I want us to notice this, because I think this is important. God gives this commandment to rest to His people that He had just rescued out of slavery. I don't know about you, but if you and I were slaves and one of God's commands was to rest, this would sound like good news. This would help me understand that the God who rescued me is the God who wants us to know Him, not through our work or not through serving Him, but through our rest, through slowing down and being with Him. And this is countercultural, especially for the Israelites who were rescued out of Egypt, because when they were in Egypt, they were slaves. And as slaves, their worth, their value, their entire identity was based on the work they were able to perform. And yet, when God rescues His people out of slavery, He knows that even as people who are free of that slavery, they would so easily get enslaved by the idolatry of work once again. That somehow we have this tendency as human beings to make work more than what it should be. that we need as human beings proper boundaries and proper boundaries and measures around work, that we actually need a commandment to help us prioritize rest. You see, you and I, thankfully aren't slaves in the literal sense. But if you and I are bound to a pace of life that doesn't reflect the inherent dignity and the worth that God places on us as His children and as His image bearers, and if we're still trying to derive our worth as human beings through what we can do or what we can achieve, we are not free. We don't have a literal master whose slave drives us, but we can still be slaves to our work. We can still be slaves to our insecurity to make something of ourselves nonetheless. So Sabbath keeping is really this gift that is helping us become aware of some of the things that you and I are bound to. It helps us become aware of our need for God's grace and work in our lives. Sabbath keeping is this tangible way for former slaves to structure their lives in such a way where work and our pursuit of making something of ourselves doesn't become an idol, where we give God the time and the space every single week to speak into our lives, to speak His love into our lives, to slowly help us overcome our insecurities and our struggles when we're in His presence. So that's the why, in terms of why we practice Sabbath keeping. And here's the practical stuff. How do we practice Sabbath keeping? I talked about this earlier, that Sabbath keeping is rest that invites us to let go. To let go of our anxieties, to let go of our compulsions that come from the need to make something of ourselves. Sabbath keeping is an invitation to reject the narrative that our worth is tied to what we can accomplish or perform. Because that's why we overwork. I mean, some of us love our jobs and love our studies, but when our loves, of our work and of our studies begin to have a negative effect on our lives or our relationships, this simply reveals how broken we are. We simply want to be loved. And in our deep insecurity, we do all we can to compensate. We do all we can to try to make something of ourselves, to make ourselves worthy in our minds of love. And whether we are aware of it or not, I think we live into this narrative that our worth is tied to what we can do. And so we play this out in our studies and in our careers and in our housekeeping, in our chores and in our relationships with others. We perform rather than simply be who we are. And Sabbath keeping is an interruption of this process that somehow takes a hold of us. Sabbath keeping is a weekly 24-hour period where we let go of the things we think we have to do in order to matter, or the things that we ought to do in order to stay afloat. We're learning how to trust God that He will take care of us in our work and our studies. And we're learning to let go of the things that we think we have to do to matter to others, because we're learning that when we pause, we matter to God. These are things that we thought we had to do or ought to do that have driven us throughout the week, and it's only when we stop that we're able to be reminded of who we truly are as God's children. And so the question I'd like for you to think about and maybe, jot some notes down on is this: what are you going to rest from during your Sabbath? During your Sabbath, what are you going to rest from? During your Sabbath, what are you going to rest from? Maybe pick 2 or 3 things that you're going to be resting from. Maybe it's literal work, and maybe some of us need to turn off the notifications on our phones, step away from email, and for a 24-hour period, just fast from that. And maybe some of us are working from home now, right? And with pandemic. And it's hard to separate where the work begins and where the work ends. There's no commute. And so it's possible for us to work anytime, all the time, wherever we are. Maybe we need to put proper boundaries around that work. Or maybe it's social media, something that we need to rest from, right? Maybe turning off notifications is a good idea. Or maybe sometimes it's household chores. And if we're home all the time and we see that our house is constantly messy, that the minute we spend, the time that we spend cleaning up, within 5 minutes, the kids will kind of like, make it look like a tornado hit us again. And it's like, we have to get at this again. The cleaning never ends. And so maybe for household chores, maybe it's important to say, you know what, there's going to be days that we will do these chores, but there's going to be a certain day where we just put a boundary around that time and we're not going to engage in some of those chores during that time. We're going to receive something else rather than constantly get at things. All right? So what are the 2 or 3 things that you're going to choose to rest from during your time of Sabbath? All right? 24 hours where you're going to rest from some of these things, some of these good things, some of these things you're responsible for. But as we rest from them, we're learning that God is the one who carries us. And as we rest from them, we're learning that there's going to be time later on for us to do those things. So Sabbath is this invitation. It is a time of rest that we let go of some of these things. And Sabbath is also rest that invites us to receive. To receive the things that remind us of God's love for us and God's goodness to us. These are some of the things that we get to do. Some of these things that we say, I can't wait to do this, right? So we're talking about the things that remind us of our worth and our value to God. And that His love for us is permanently embedded into us. That we are made in His image, that we're made for relationship with Him, that we are His children. These are some of the things that we get to do that remind us of these things. And so during your Sabbath, I want to ask you this question, and you can write down some of the things that you're going to plan to do. What are some life-giving activities that you're going to engage in? So during Sabbath is not just pausing from the work and pausing from the activity that kind of kept you going and that kept you revved up and the pace that you were living at that was fast. As we rest, God is inviting us to receive things that we can do in His presence that are life-giving. What are some of these life-giving activities that you're going to engage in? And so I invite you to pick 1 or 2. And don't make a list of like 5 or 10. I know that some of us, when we go on vacation, we make a huge itinerary, right? From the morning we wake up, we know exactly where we're going to eat. We know the first 5 things we're going to see before it's even 9 in the morning, right? And so some of us are wired that way. And I think there's this temptation for us to make Sabbath, in terms of all the activities we get to do, another huge list. And I'm saying, no, you don't need a list. You need 1 or 2 things, right? 1 or 2 things, because it's all about the margins. It's all about not just what we're up to. It's all about the free time that we're actually trying to experience as well. Sometimes God meets us not just in the activities that we do to receive His love. Sometimes He meets us in the free time, in the spontaneous space that we give Him. And so some tips here. This needs to be intentional, so some planning is involved, but don't make a huge to-do list. These need to be activities that are easily achievable and are low prep. Because if you're spending so much time prepping before you get to the activities, you've kind of made something else that you're kind of stressed in order to do, right? And you want as few variables as possible. So you don't want this to be like weather-dependent stuff, or it requires the participation of 10 other people and they all have to get their act together in order for you to do this, right? And so you want this to be easily achievable, low prep. And so we're talking about things like a simple walk around the neighborhood, a hike, a bike ride. We're talking about preparing a special meal at an unhurried pace, right? And maybe for those of us who have kids, this is a meal you can do with your kids, like maybe making pizza or tacos, something where it's messy and silly and fun. And it's not about getting all the ingredients right. It's just about enjoying time together, the play of eating together. This could be working on a puzzle or a craft that you really enjoy and maybe having some music in the background. Or maybe it's visiting friends. And I understand it's pandemic right now, but one day we're going to get to do this. But maybe it's visiting friends or inviting people over for a meal and just enjoying the presence of others. I think God encounters us in this way as we slow down and we make time for people. And maybe some of the things that we can do during Sabbath too is to not overpack that 24 hours so that there's time and space for maybe people to knock on your door and say hi. Again, this is after pandemic, hopefully. People to interrupt you, and we find joy in the interruptions when we don't overplan our day. All right? So Sabbath keeping is this invitation to embrace the good news that our worth, our value is based on none other than God's absolutely reckless love for us. I mean, when we slow down and we do nothing and we just enjoy being with Him and being with others, we are reminded that we are made in His image, that we are His children. And even as His children, when we are lost and when we didn't want anything to do with Him, He didn't stop loving us. He actually doubled down on His love for us. He sent Jesus to find us and give His life for us. See, Sabbath keeping is this invitation to embrace our worth and value as God's beloved children. When we're freed from our work, from our need to prove anything to ourselves or to others, that's when we experience God's love for us. All right, so my question is, what day of the week will be your day of rest? When are you going to set aside 24 hours where you can, consciously let go of some of the things that drive you, some of the things that cause you to live at a pace that just isn't good for you, and receive from God what He wants to give you, so that you can live and you can work out of a place of rest, out of a place of love, out of a place of security. So what day of the week will be your day of rest? And as you think about that, I just want to remind you that Sabbath is not a reward for hard work. I mean, we live in a culture that says if you want to rest, you better work hard. Another way of saying this is we work hard and then we play hard. Note the order, that work comes before rest. And that's because that's how our culture orders work and rest. And because of that, we often believe that Sabbath is a reward for hard work. And as people who live into this and believe this, then we feel like we only deserve Sabbath is if during the 6 days before we work ourselves to the bone. And at some churches, this exhaustion is actually seen as a badge of honor. And I want to push back against that. You see, the good news that we see in Scripture is that Sabbath is not a reward for hard work. Sabbath is not something that we earn. It's not something that we deserve. Sabbath is a gift that comes before work. Sabbath is a gift that enables us, empowers us to work. This is actually built into the biblical rhythm of rest and work. Get this, in Genesis 1, God creates the world in 6 days. And on the 6th day, He created Adam and Eve. Their first day is the 7th day, and that 7th day is the day where God created rest. You see, for Adam and Eve, they began their existence not with work, but with rest. Before they joined God in His work in creation, they joined God in His rest so that they may know Him, so that they may be filled with their relationship with Him, so that they may work out of that knowledge and out of that relationship and out of that love. That's the way Scripture sees the rhythm of rest and work. And I mean, this is crazy because if we really think about this and this concept, it blows my mind because I thought I was familiar with the concept of a sabbatical when it comes to work or when it comes to career. There's some jobs that offer the benefit of a sabbatical, but only after you have worked a certain number of years. You know, if you talk to professors, usually it's 6 or 7 years before they are able to take a sabbatical. At Hope City Church, we're a little more humane, and we're looking at 5 years before, you know, a pastor will take a sabbatical. You know, I got to enjoy that sabbatical. I came back refreshed. I'm so grateful for it. But if you read the biblical rhythm right, there's something else that's going on. We still see sabbatical as something where you put in the time, you put in the work, and then you get to rest. But imagine being a professor and imagine getting hired on, and before you even teach a class, before you even write a research paper or collaborate on any of that type of work, the university actually says, hey, before you come onto campus, just take a year off to recharge, to get yourself right, that you can come and be refreshed and ready to go to teach and to work and to study. Imagine that. Like, I want to work for a university that has that culture. How many of us would apply right away? But that's the point I'm trying to make, that this concept of rest, this concept of Sabbath that God is inviting to, it's deeply countercultural, even for our Christian institutions. He's inviting us to rest, and this rest is like His grace. It's not a reward, it's a gift. He wants us to live and work out of the gift of rest that He gives us, out of a place of security, out of a place of love. That's why He calls us. That's why He invites us. That's why He prescribes the Sabbath to us. And so as you think about this, you know, again, I want us to come away with a simple plan. What day of the week will be your day of rest, your Sabbath? You got to pick a day. You got to pick that 24-hour period. And then during your Sabbath, what are you going to rest from? What are you going to let go of? What are you going to put aside and say, during these 24 hours, I'm not going to do that, or I'm not going to check that, or I'm not going to be driven by the anxiety that comes from being exposed to that. And finally, during your Sabbath, what life-giving activities are you going to engage in? What are you going to choose to do, plan to do? Things that help remind you of who you are as a child of God, and who you are not just in connection to Him, but as you're connected to others. All right? I hope that not only are we learning about Sabbath, but my prayer is that during this year, where we are kind of forced to slow down in some ways, that we actually are taking concrete steps in building time into our weekly rhythm so that we can be with God, we can be rejuvenated, we can grow deeper as a church. All right, I hope to see you next week. Take care.